She fired him at 9:47 in the morning. By 10:03, men with automatic weapons had seized every floor of her building. By noon, every one of those men was either dead, zip-tied to a stairwell railing, or praying they'd never set foot inside Mercer Global Tower. The woman who had dismissed Logan Hayes as a careless maintenance worker was now crouched behind an overturned conference table, watching him move through the smoke like something she had no vocabulary for, silent, precise, terrifying, in the way that only truly trained things are terrifying. She had fired the one man in that building who could save her life, and he saved it anyway. If this story already has you locked in, hit subscribe right now and don't go anywhere. Drop your city or country in the comments below so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled. Hit that like button and follow along until the very last word. Because what happens inside Mercer Global Tower is the kind of story that doesn't let go of you long after it's over. The lighting panel on the 43rd floor had been malfunctioning for 11 days. 11 days of flickering overhead fluorescence. 11 days of maintenance tickets submitted and ignored. 11 days of executive assistants complaining about headaches and HR sending passive-aggressive emails about workplace comfort standards. 11 days that nobody in leadership had bothered to actually fix the problem, because fixing problems required noticing them, and the people on the 43rd floor of Mercer Global Tower were paid to notice very different things. Logan Hayes noticed everything. He'd been noticing things his entire adult life. It was less a habit than a reflex, the kind that gets trained into a person through enough years of environments where not noticing something could get you and everyone around you killed. He noticed the slight vibration in the elevator cables when the car descended past the 38th floor, which meant the tension needed adjustment. He noticed the water stain on the ceiling tile near the east stairwell that was slightly darker than yesterday, which meant the roof membrane above it was continuing to fail. He noticed the way the security guard at the lobby desk, a young guy named Derek, who always nodded at Logan in the mornings, had a different energy today. Shoulders tight, jaw set, eyes doing that thing where they track toward the entrance every 30 seconds or so. He filed it away. People had bad mornings. He had plenty of his own. Logan set his tool bag down beside the panel housing and crouched to examine it. The cover plate had already been removed by whoever had made the initial report, and someone had taped a handwritten note to the wall that read, "Do not touch, awaiting facilities." He pulled the note off, folded it once, tucked it in his shirt pocket out of habit, and got to work. The problem turned out to be a corroded relay coupling. Not complicated, not expensive, just the kind of slow degradation that happened when a building this size deferred maintenance long enough that small things became moderately annoying things. Logan replaced the coupling, tested the circuit, watched the fluorescence above him stabilize into steady, even light. He'd been doing this work for 2 years. 2 years since he'd walked out of a recruitment office in Virginia and told them he was done, that he had a kid to raise, that he was 35 years old, and had spent 15 years being very good at something he no longer wanted to be good at. The woman behind the desk had looked at him the way people sometimes looked at him, like she wasn't sure what to do with the disconnect between what his file said he was and what was standing in front of her. This broad-shouldered man in a plain gray shirt who spoke quietly and moved like someone who'd learned long ago that stillness was its own kind of presence. He hadn't told her about his son in any detail. He just said the boy needed him and left it at that. Caleb was 8 years old. He had his mother's eyes and Logan's stubbornness, and he could not fall asleep unless the hall light was on, which was the kind of detail Logan kept to himself in most company. This morning, Caleb had spilled orange juice on his backpack and cried about it with the total devastation that only an 8-year-old can summon over something that small. And Logan had dried the backpack with the kitchen towel and told him the juice had made it stronger, which was ridiculous. And Caleb had known it was ridiculous, but he'd laughed anyway. And that sound had carried Logan through the morning commute and up the elevator and into the 43rd floor's malfunctioning lighting situation with something that almost felt like okay. He was repacking his tool bag when he heard the heels. Victoria Sinclair moved the way people moved when they expected the hallway to clear itself in advance of their arrival. Not arrogance exactly, more like someone who had spent enough years being the most important person in every room she entered that her body had simply absorbed the expectation. She was 30 years old, which was either remarkable or terrifying depending on where you sat in the Mercer Global org chart, and she had built the company from a 6-person startup in a rented office in Austin to a $12 billion technology empire in 7 years through a combination of genuine brilliance, absolute intolerance for incompetence, and the kind of relentless focus that left very little room for anything that wasn't useful to her immediate goals. She had approximately 400 things on her mind right now. The Ardent Technologies acquisition was signing in 3 hours. 3 hours, and there were still 2 clauses in the secondary agreement that her legal team had flagged overnight that needed to be resolved before the 1 p.m. close. And her CFO kept calling instead of texting, which meant he was nervous, which meant she needed to not be standing in this hallway. She almost walked past Logan entirely. Then she saw the tool bag and the removed panel cover propped against the wall, and the handwritten note in his shirt pocket. She stopped. "Excuse me." Logan looked up. He hadn't heard her coming. He'd heard her, obviously, but he'd assessed and categorized the sound as non-relevant and continued working. That distinction, he understood, probably already annoyed her. "Yes, ma'am." "Did you remove the out-of-service notice from this panel?" He stood. I wasn't quite 6 feet, but he was built in a way that made the question of height beside the point, and he had a face that was not unfriendly, but was also not particularly readable. "I did. The work's finished." "That notice was placed by our facilities manager." "Okay, the work's still finished." Victoria stared at him for a moment. "Do you know what that notice was for?" "A corroded relay coupling, causing the flickering on this floor for the past 11 days. He held her gaze. "It's fixed now." She looked at the overhead lights, which were, she had to admit, noticeably steadier. Then she looked back at him. "Who authorized you to proceed ahead of the facilities manager's timeline?" The work order said urgent. The note said awaiting facilities. Logan looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite patience and not quite impatience, but something in between. A man who had learned how to wait out situations without surrendering his position in them. "Ma'am, the relay coupling was corroded. Left another week, it would have shorted and potentially tripped the breakers on this floor. Given that your executive suite is on this floor, I thought it was better to fix it." Victoria's jaw tightened. She was very good at reading people. It was one of the skills she was most privately proud of. And there was something about this man she couldn't immediately categorize, which bothered her more than the specific situation warranted. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't apologetic. He was just standing there. "What's your name?" "Logan Hayes, Maintenance, Building Services." "Mr. Hayes." She said his name the way she said most things, measured, deliberate. When something in this building is marked awaiting facilities, it means there is a process. Processes exist for a reason. An employee who decides unilaterally that his judgment supersedes the established process is an employee who creates liability. Or an employee who fixed your lights. The silence that followed that sentence lasted about 2 seconds, which was enough. "Come with me," Victoria said. The HR office on the 42nd floor smelled like printer toner and someone's microwaved lunch. A woman named Deborah, who clearly had not been expecting to facilitate a termination at 9:30 in the morning, pulled up the relevant forms on her computer with the specific efficiency of someone who felt bad about what they were doing but was going to do it correctly. Logan sat across the desk from her with his tool bag on his lap and listened to the language. Procedural violation, insubordination, failure to comply with established directives, with an expression that gave away very little. He was thinking about the security guard's jaw. He was thinking about the fact that in 2 years at Mercer Global, he had never once seen a delivery arrive without being logged at the front desk. And this morning, coming through the lobby, he had noticed 2 men he didn't recognize moving a freight cart toward the service elevator without a log sticker on any of the boxes. He had almost said something to Derek about it. Then Derek's phone had buzzed, and Derek had turned away and Logan had filed it and gotten in the elevator. He was thinking about that now. Deborah slid a form across the desk. "If you'd like to sign acknowledging receipt of the separation notice, I don't have to sign that." "No," she agreed. "You don't." He stood, picked up his tool bag, and looked at the form for a moment. Then he looked at Deborah, who was clearly miserable. "You're just doing your job," he told her, not unkindly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes." He nodded once, walked out. I was in the stairwell on the 38th floor, descending toward the lobby, when he heard it. Not gunshots, not yet. What he heard was the sudden, total absence of the ambient noise a building this size constantly produced. The ventilation hum, the distant elevator mechanics, the low white noise conversation that leaked through walls and ceilings like water. All of it vanished in the space of about 4 seconds, replaced by a sound he recognized in a place in his nervous system that had nothing to do with thought. Boots. Multiple. Coordinated. He stopped on the landing. He set his tool bag down very carefully against the wall, unzipped it, and started thinking. The first alarm came at 10:03 a.m. Not the building fire alarm, which required someone to pull a station or a heat sensor to trip, but the security console alarm on the lobby desk, which meant the lobby desk had been compromised, which meant Derek was either on the floor or worse. The building's PA system crackled twice and then went silent, which told Logan that whoever had come in had cut the central communications hub within the first 2 minutes of entry. That was professional. That was not a robbery. He was already moving. He took the east stairwell to the 35th floor, exited into a supply corridor, and pressed himself against the wall beside a maintenance closet while he listened to the building reorganize itself around the event happening inside it. He could hear people running above him, civilian running, panicked and uncoordinated, the sound of desk chairs scraping and people calling each other's names. He could also hear, somewhere below, the kind of movement that was the opposite of that: quiet, systematic, deliberate. He counted 4 distinct patterns of footsteps in the stairwell below him, at least 2 more somewhere off to his left, probably in the main corridor. 6 minimum, probably more. He opened the maintenance closet. Victoria had been in her office on the 43rd floor when the alarm sounded, or rather, when the alarm didn't sound, when instead of the noise and protocol she'd drilled her staff on, the building simply went strange and quiet in a way that made the hair on her arms stand up before she'd consciously processed why. Her head of security, a man named Garrett, who she paid very well and who was currently not answering his phone, had once given a presentation about active threat scenarios that she had half listened to while reviewing acquisition documents. She now found herself wishing she had paid more attention. Her assistant, a young woman named Priya, appeared in the doorway with a face that had gone the color of old paper. "Miss Sinclair, I think something is... I don't know what's happening, but I think we need to... Lock the office door," Victoria said. Her voice was steady. She was good at steady. "The security feed is..." Priya held up her phone. The lobby camera showed static. "It's down." Victoria walked to her window. 43 floors below, she could see vehicles, black, unmarked, parked at angles across the main plaza in a pattern that wasn't random. She looked at it for about 3 seconds. "Don't use your phone," she said. Get away from the windows. Get under the desk." "Ms. Sinclair." "Now, Priya." She was still looking at the plaza when her office door opened. The man who came through it was not someone she recognized. He was wearing tactical gear and holding a weapon with the particular casual confidence of someone who had held weapons in professional settings before. He had a radio on his vest that crackled once with a voice speaking something clipped and abbreviated. Behind him, a second man appeared in the doorway. "Victoria Sinclair," the first man said. Not a question. She looked at him. She thought about the signing at 1 p.m. She thought about the 2 unflagged clauses. She thought, absurdly, about the fact that she'd spent 30 minutes this morning picking between 2 essentially identical blazers. "Yes," she said. They were moving her toward the stairwell, hands bound with a zip tie, the second man's grip on her arm firm without being rough, which somehow made it worse, when the lights on the 43rd floor went out. Not all of them, just the corridor lighting in a precise sequence from east to west, as if each fixture was being switched off individually by someone who knew exactly where the junction boxes were. The first man raised his weapon. The second tightened his grip on Victoria's arm. For maybe 4 seconds, nobody moved. Then something happened in the darkness near the east service door that Victoria did not fully see. A sound, a rush of air, a brief commotion that was violent and immediate and over before she could track it, and the second man's grip disappeared. In the residual light coming through the office windows, she could see the first man sweeping his weapon across the corridor. "Contact," he said into his radio. 43, East Corridor. 1 civilian secured. Unknown." The radio produced a burst of static. Then his weapon was gone too. Victoria pressed herself against the wall and stared into the corridor. Logan Hayes stepped out of the shadows near the service door, moving with a deliberateness that she had no framework for, checking the corridor in both directions with the same expression she'd seen on his face in the HR office 40 minutes ago. Not cold exactly, not heated, just present in a way that consumed the entire space around him. He was carrying the first man's radio. He had the second man's zip ties in his other hand. He looked at her. "Ms. Sinclair." She stared at him. "We need to move," he said. You just got—" She stopped. "You were fired." Something crossed his face that wasn't quite amusement. "Yeah, I was." He crossed to her, examined the zip tie on her wrists, produced a small folding blade from somewhere and cut it with one motion. "Buildings locked down. Minimum 6 entry-level operators. Likely command structure somewhere above us. Comms already severed." He handed her the radio. "Hold on to that. Don't press anything." She took it automatically. "Who are these people?" "Don't know yet." He glanced toward the stairwell. "Can you move fast in those shoes?" She looked down at her heels, then back at him. The absurdity of the question in the context of everything else happening almost cracked something loose in her chest. She pulled off both shoes, held them, then looked at him steadily. "Yes." He almost nodded. "Good. Stay close, stay quiet, do exactly what I tell you when I tell you. Don't argue about it. I'm the CEO of this, Ms. Sinclair." The way he said it was quiet and extremely clear. "Right now, you're a person I'm trying to keep alive. Everything else is secondary." He paused. "Including the part where I used to work here." She held his gaze for a moment, then she nodded. "Which way?" she asked. Logan Hayes turned toward the east stairwell, moving like something the building had produced specifically for this moment. Like the 11 days of flickering lights and the corroded relay coupling and the HR form, and all of it had been nothing more than the building's way of making sure he was exactly here, on exactly this floor, at exactly this time. "This way," he said, "and don't make a sound." She followed him into the dark. The east stairwell smelled like concrete dust and something chemical, a cleaning product maybe, or something the mercenaries had used on the security panel at the base of the shaft. Logan clocked it without breaking stride, filing it as information rather than concern. Victoria was 2 steps behind him, her bare feet silent on the metal landing, and he had to admit she was doing better than most trained personnel he'd shepherded through bad situations. She wasn't hyperventilating. She wasn't talking. She was watching where he looked and adjusting her own attention accordingly, which told him she was more adaptive than her 45 minutes of acquaintance with him had suggested. He stopped at the 39th floor landing, held up a closed fist. She stopped immediately. "Good." He pressed his ear toward the door. On the other side, 2 voices. Male, clipped exchange, the specific economy of men who communicate in shared shorthand. He couldn't make out individual words, but he didn't need to. The rhythm told him enough. Stationary, waiting, not currently moving toward anything. Guard position. Door probably alarmed or watched. He held up 2 fingers, pointed at the door, then down toward the stairs continuing below. She nodded. They kept going. On the 36th floor, he pulled her into a maintenance corridor that ran parallel to the main hallway, accessible through a utility door that required a keycard he'd had for 2 years and had never actually thought about beyond its functional purpose until this exact moment. The corridor was narrow and dark, lit only by emergency strip lighting along the baseboard, and it smelled like the inside of a building. Insulation, an old pipe, and the accumulated dry warmth of a structure that had been breathing recycled air for 30 years. Victoria pressed her back against the wall beside him while he pulled up a mental map of the floor. "How many floors are we talking about?" she asked. Her voice was barely above a breath. "Unclear. They're holding the lobby and the primary security hub. Probably have coverage on every stairwell access below the 30th floor." He thought for a second. "The freight elevator shaft runs separate from the main system, controlled from the basement mechanical room." "Which means what?" "Which means if they haven't found it yet, it's an option. If they have, it's a kill box." He looked at her. "I want to find out which one before we commit to it." She absorbed this with a stillness he was starting to recognize as her default processing mode. No visible reaction, just intake and calculation. "How?" He held up the radio he'd taken from the man in the corridor. "I'm going to listen for a while." He turned the volume down to a whisper and held it close to his ear. The traffic on the channel was sparse but revealing. Check-ins, position confirmations, brief status reports in the kind of compressed language that meant these people had trained together, had protocols, had someone at the top of the structure feeding them information and coordinating movement. Whoever had organized this was not improvising. Three things became clear in about 90 seconds of listening. The lobby was locked down with at least 4 men. The building's external communications had been severed at the junction box in the basement, and someone designated only as control was operating from what sounded like a mobile command position rather than inside the building. That last detail was important. It meant the people inside were executing a plan, not adapting one, which meant the plan had gaps they didn't know about yet. He lowered the radio. "There are people still on the upper floors," Victoria said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "My employees?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. He could see something moving in her face. Not fear exactly, more like a woman recalculating her position on a map she'd been reading wrong. "What do we do?" Logan turned to look down the maintenance corridor, then back at her. "I need to reach the 32nd floor. There's a secondary communications panel there. Building intercom system, independent circuit. If it hasn't been cut, I can use it to coordinate." "Coordinate what?" "Getting people out." He met her eyes. "There's a service access on 32 that opens to the building's north face. Fire escape, old code requirement. Most people in this building don't know it exists because it was never included in the standard emergency maps." He paused. "I found it 14 months ago when I was replacing insulation on the exterior wall." Victoria stared at him for a moment. Then, with the particular expression of someone who is revising a substantial number of prior assessments simultaneously, "You know this building better than anyone in it." "Maintenance usually does," he said. "Not with any edge, just the fact of it." She looked away briefly. He noticed but didn't comment on it. "Let's go," she said. The 32nd floor was partially occupied. Logan heard them before he opened the maintenance corridor access. Maybe a dozen people, clustered near the interior conference room, the low murmur of frightened conversation and the occasional sound of someone crying quietly. He did a fast visual sweep through the door's small safety glass panel, confirmed no tactical presence on this floor, and eased the door open. The first person who saw him was a young man in a dress shirt with his tie already pulled loose, who jerked back against the wall with an expression that was 3 parts terror and 1 part relief so overwhelming it looked almost like grief. "Hey," Logan said quietly. "I work here, building maintenance." He stepped out of the corridor and Victoria followed him, and the young man's eyes went from Logan to her with a recognition that shifted the entire room's atmosphere. "Miss Sinclair." Someone in the back said it like a prayer. Victoria stepped forward. Her shoes were still in her hand, her blazer had a scuff on the left sleeve from where she'd pressed against the stairwell wall, and she had the look of someone who had made a decision and was standing in it fully. "Is everyone accounted for? Is anyone hurt?" The murmur sorted itself into information. 14 people on this floor, 2 hiding in offices down the hall, 1 woman who had twisted her ankle running, no serious injuries. A man in his 50s who introduced himself as Richard Patel from the finance department had been trying to reach 911 with no success, his phone showing a signal, but all calls dropping immediately. "They're running a jammer," Logan said. He crossed to the communications panel on the wall near the kitchen area, a beige box that most people in the building probably believed was a thermostat. He opened it. "Cell and standard comms both. Building internet is down too?" Several people confirmed it. Logan examined the panel's internal wiring. The intercom system ran on a dedicated analog line that predated the building's digital overhaul by about 12 years, which meant there was a reasonable chance it was running on a frequency the mercenaries' jammer wasn't calibrated for. He started tracing the circuit. "What can we do?" Richard Patel asked. He was addressing Logan directly, which Logan noticed, and which told him something about how the situation had reorganized the room's sense of authority. "I need everyone quiet for a few minutes," Logan said. "After that, I'm going to start moving you toward the north stairwell. We're going floor by floor." "Floor by floor?" A woman near the window, young, dark hair, the specific look of someone who wanted to be useful and didn't know how, turned toward him. "There are people on every floor above us too." "I know." He found the circuit he was looking for, tested it with a small multimeter from his tool bag. Signal present. He exhaled once, slowly. "That's why we're starting here." He picked up the intercom handset and held it for a moment, running the math. If the system was live on upper floors too, his voice would reach anyone near a panel. If the mercenaries were monitoring it, possible, but unlikely given the age of the system, He'd be giving away his position on the floor. He waited for about 4 seconds. He pressed the transmit button. "This is Logan Hayes, building maintenance, 32nd floor." He kept his voice low and even. "If you can hear this on any floor, do not use elevators. Do not use the main stairwells below floor 30. There is a north service exit on floors 32, 28, and 24, accessible through the maintenance corridor, the door with the yellow utility stripe. Start moving toward those exits now. Move quietly. Move low. I'll have someone at each access point." He released the button. Waited. Static. Then, a voice thin with distance and what might have been tears barely controlled. "This is Amara Osei. I'm on 35 with about 8 people. We heard gunshots earlier and we've been..." A breath. "We've been under a desk for an hour." "Amara," Logan said, "you're okay. How many people with you?" 9. "One of them is Marcus from IT, and he has asthma, and he doesn't have his inhaler." "Okay, north corridor, 35th floor, yellow striped door. I'll have someone there in 12 minutes. Can you get there?" "I think so. I think yes." "Good, go now. Move slow and quiet. If you hear anyone on the stairs, stop and wait." He set down the handset and turned to the room. Victoria was watching him with an expression he couldn't fully read, which was unusual for him. He was generally competent at reading people's faces. It wasn't admiration exactly. It wasn't the particular resentment of someone watching a person they'd dismissed perform beyond expectations, which was a thing he'd seen before and would have understood. It was something quieter than either of those, something still in the process of forming. "I need 2 volunteers," he said, "people who can stay calm and move carefully. I'll position them at the access points on 28 and 24 while I work the stairwell." Richard Patel stepped forward without hesitation. The young woman with dark hair stepped forward half a second after him. "Good." Logan turned to Victoria. "You stay with the main group. Once I clear the north stairwell down to 24, Richard moves his group first." "I'll go with you," she said. "No." "Logan, Ms. Sinclair." He said it the same way he'd said it on the 43rd floor, and it landed the same way. "You are the reason those people are in this building right now, which means you are also the best reason for everyone in this building to stay calm and believe they're getting out." He held her gaze. "So you stay visible, and you stay with your people, and you let me do what I know how to do, okay?" A long beat. Something in her jaw shifted. "Okay," she said. He moved through the 32nd floor's maintenance corridor and into the north stairwell with a fire extinguisher he'd pulled from the wall bracket, and the multimeter and a length of copper wire from his tool bag, none of which would have looked to anyone like weapons. The first man he encountered was on the 29th floor landing. He was young, couldn't have been more than 25, and he had the posture of someone who had been standing in the same position for too long and was starting to let his attention drift. His weapon was lowered. His radio was in his hand instead of on his vest, which meant he was waiting for a check-in rather than actively sweeping. Logan came through the stairwell door moving low and fast, and the encounter lasted 4 seconds. The man was on the floor before he'd completed the turn, and Logan had his radio and his weapon, a compact submachine gun he recognized by feel before he'd even looked at it, and was already moving toward the 28th floor access. He felt the familiar settling that happened in his body when these situations activated something he'd spent 2 years trying to turn off. It wasn't comfortable exactly. It wasn't a feeling he'd ever tried to describe to anyone, because the only people who would have understood it had been standing next to him in places he didn't go to in his head anymore. What it was, functionally, was clarity. The particular clarity of a person who is exactly as prepared as the situation requires and not 1 degree more, and who knows it. He hated that it felt like coming home. On the 28th floor, he positioned Richard Patel at the maintenance access with brief, specific instructions. "Open the door. When you hear a knock in sets of 3, do not open for any other sound. Get everyone through as fast as possible. Keep moving north. Do not stop." Richard nodded once. He was steadier than Logan had expected, which he filed as useful. On the way back through the 29th landing, he zip-tied the unconscious mercenary to the stairwell railing, using the man's own restraints, which felt appropriate, and kept moving. The 4th floor of the upper cluster was where things complicated. He was on the 31st floor, moving a group of 7 through the north corridor toward the service access, when the radio on his vest, the one he'd taken from the first man on 43, came alive with something that changed the entire shape of what he'd been working with. All units, all units. Command has a confirmed sighting, 32 North. Execute containment. Do not let them reach the service exits. They'd found the intercom transmission. Logan stopped, counted the people behind him. 3 administrative staff, a data analyst named Kevin, who kept apologizing for reasons Logan couldn't track, a woman named Sandra, who had been absolutely silent and was clearly running on the specific fuel of someone who has decided to simply hold on until this is over, and made a fast calculation. "Change of plan," he said. "We're not using the north exit." He turned and looked at Kevin. "Is there a storage room on this floor?" Kevin blinked. Yes. 31C. It's where they keep... It's kind of a junk room, old IT equipment. Take everyone there. Lock it from the inside. Don't open it unless you hear 3 knocks, then 2, then 3. He looked at the group. Memorize that. 323, Sandra said immediately, in the flat tone of someone committing something to memory. Good. He was already turning. I'll be back. Where are you going? Kevin asked, with the voice of someone who very much wanted the answer to be somewhere safe and nearby. Logan looked at him. To slow them down. He went back into the stairwell. What he did in the next 20 minutes was not something he could have fully explained to anyone who hadn't done it, and not something he would have wanted to. He used the building the way he'd always understood it, but had never until today been required to demonstrate. The service corridors that ran between floors like a secondary nervous system, the utility access points that opened into spaces most people in the building didn't know existed, the specific acoustic properties of the stairwells that let you hear someone 3 flights up if you pressed your shoulder against the wall at the right angle. He disabled the surveillance relay station on the 30th floor, which cut the mercenaries' internal camera access to the upper floors, and would, he estimated, create roughly 6 minutes of confusion in their command structure before they adapted. He used that 6 minutes to move 3 separate groups through routes that weren't on any of the building's official emergency maps. Loading dock access, a maintenance bridge between the 34th and 35th floor mechanical rooms, a freight corridor that terminated at a stairwell the building's architects had included in the original blueprint and which had apparently never made it into any documentation filed with the city. He got 31 people out through the building's north face before the mercenaries recalibrated. He didn't get out himself. I was on the 33rd floor when 2 of them caught up to him. Found him more accurately because the way they moved made clear they'd been vectoring in on something and had finally closed the angle. One came through the main corridor door and one through the stairwell access nearly simultaneously, which was competent, and Logan was in the open hallway between them with no cover and nothing in his hands except the fire extinguisher he'd been carrying since the 29th floor. He used it. He threw it at the man in the corridor, not as a weapon, but as a distraction. It hit the floor and skidded, and the man's eyes tracked it involuntarily, which was half a second. And he was already moving toward the stairwell man, inside the weapon's effective range before the man could swing it. And what followed was brief and ugly, and not something that belonged in any story that wanted to feel clean. He came out of it with a cut on his left forearm from where the stairwell man's vest buckle had caught him when they went down, and both men zip-tied together back-to-back around a support column, and his hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline. He pressed his back against the wall and breathed, just breathed. In the silence of the empty hallway, he thought about Caleb, which was not a useful thing to think about, but which happened anyway. About the orange juice on the backpack this morning. About the way Caleb's face had gone from devastated to laughing in about 30 seconds because Logan had said something ridiculous about juice making things stronger. The shake in his hand slowed and stopped. He thought, I need to get back to that kid. That was the thing that cut through everything else. Not training, not muscle memory, not the particular brutal clarity of the past 2 years reasserting itself. Just that. A boy who needed the hall light on and who would cry about orange juice on a backpack, and who was, right now, at school, doing whatever 8-year-olds did on Thursday afternoons, not knowing. Logan pushed off the wall, checked the corridor, and kept moving. He found Victoria where he'd left her, on the 32nd floor with the remaining group, which had grown to 17 as people from the floors immediately above had found their way down during the confusion he'd created. She was sitting on the floor against the wall with her blazer folded in her lap and her knees pulled to her chest, talking quietly to a young woman beside her who was holding herself like someone trying to keep all her pieces in contact with each other. She looked up when he came through the door. Her eyes went to the cut on his forearm immediately. "You're bleeding," she said. "It's minor." He crossed to the group, did a quick count, did a mental map of what had changed in the building since he'd left. "I need everyone to listen. The north exit is going to have coverage now. We're going to the East Mechanical Bridge, 28th floor. Different route, shorter exposure." "What happened?" Victoria stood, and the young woman she'd been sitting with straightened slightly, as if the act of Victoria standing had given her permission to be more okay. "Ran into two of them, both dealt with." He looked at her. "I need you to help me move these people fast. Some of them are going to hesitate at the mechanical bridge. It's narrow, there's a drop on both sides. People get scared." "Then I'll go first," she said. He looked at her. "If they see me go first," she said with a practicality that suggested she had thought it through rather than arrived at it emotionally, "they'll follow, right?" He considered this for a moment. It was not wrong. "Yeah," he said. "That's right." "Then I go first." She bent down and picked up her shoes, which she had been holding since the 43rd floor, which struck him only now as a detail that was somehow specific and human in a way that the rest of the situation wasn't, and looked at him steadily. "Lead the way, Mr. Hayes." He almost said something. He decided not to. He turned and moved toward the corridor, and 17 people fell in behind him, and Victoria Sinclair walked at the front of the line without her shoes on. And if any of them were thinking about how different this looked from the company they thought they worked for this morning, none of them said so. The East Mechanical Bridge connected the 33rd floor of the main tower to a fire egress platform above the building's adjacent parking structure, a design detail that existed because of a code requirement from 1987 that no one had ever thought to remove. The bridge was a metal walkway about 40 feet long and maybe 4 feet wide, enclosed on the sides by chain-link fencing but open above, crossing a gap of about 60 feet above the parking structure's roof. Logan went across first to confirm it was clear. Then he came back. "It's narrow," he told the group. "Don't look down. Walk steady. Don't grab the fencing because it transfers vibration and it'll make the people behind you unsteady." He looked at the young woman who'd been sitting with Victoria. "You okay?" She looked at the bridge, then back at him. "Not really." "That's honest," he said. "Walk anyway." She almost laughed. Not quite, but almost. Victoria went first, crossing with a deliberateness that wasn't bravado. She was scared. He could read that clearly enough. The slight forward lean of someone pressing into resistance rather than being propelled by confidence, but which held and which did exactly what he'd predicted. The group followed her like she'd pulled them on a string. Logan went last. He kept his eyes on the building behind them, on the windows of the floors they'd left, watching for movement, watching for the shape of a man in tactical gear appearing at a window. When he cleared the bridge to the parking structure roof and turned to look back at Mercer Global Tower, the building looked exactly the same as it always had, glass and steel, and 43 floors of a company that had been, until this morning, about acquiring another company and filing quarterly reports and making sure the lighting panels were functioning on the executive floor. Something in his chest tightened and released. He counted heads on the parking structure roof, 17 plus himself. He looked at each face briefly, frightened, exhausted, some of them in tears, Kevin the data analyst pressing his hands flat against his thighs like he was trying to keep them still, and felt the weight of it the way he always felt the weight of it, which was without ceremony, because there wasn't time and because it wouldn't have helped anything anyway. "Keep moving," he said. "North ramp down to street level. Don't stop until you're 2 blocks from the building. If you have a signal out there, call 911 and give them your names." People started moving. Richard Patel clapped him once on the shoulder. A quick, firm contact, the gesture of a man who didn't know what else to do with gratitude that size, and then moved with the group. Victoria hung back. She was looking at him with that expression again, the one still in the process of forming. "There are still people inside," she said. "Yes." "And you're going back in." He looked at the building. The cut on his arm had stopped bleeding, but his sleeve was dark with it, and his hands were dirty with the particular grime of maintenance corridors and stairwell concrete, and he was aware, in the distant way of someone not ready to fully process it, that he had spent the last several hours being something he had spent 2 years trying not to be. "I'm going back in," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The wind came across the parking structure roof and moved her hair, and she looked for just a second like something other than the CEO of a $12 billion company. Like a person, specifically, which was a smaller and more particular thing. Why? She asked. Not as a challenge, just genuinely. He thought about Caleb, about orange juice, about the voice on the intercom. We've been under a desk for an hour. Because there are still people under desks, he said. He went back across the bridge. He crossed the mechanical bridge alone, and the building took him back the way buildings take back the people who know them. Without ceremony, without acknowledgement, just the fact of the space and the fact of him moving through it. The 33rd floor was quiet, quiet in the way that meant something had changed while he was gone. Not the quiet of emptiness. There were still people somewhere in this building. He could feel it the way you feel a crowd through a wall, that diffuse human pressure, but the quiet of a tactical operation that had recalibrated. The mercenaries knew now that someone inside was dismantling their containment. They knew he'd moved people through routes they hadn't covered. They knew, which meant they were adjusting. And an operation adjusting to an unknown variable inside its perimeter was an operation that had shifted from confident execution to controlled anger, and controlled anger made people less patient and less careful in ways that were both useful and dangerous. He pulled the radio and listened. The chatter had changed in texture, less position checking, more directed searching. Someone senior had apparently recounted the situation to Control because there was a voice he hadn't heard before. Flat, measured, the particular tone of a man who was not happy about what he was being told, but was not going to express that in a way that would degrade his people's performance. Control told them to lock the upper floors and pull the search back to a containment perimeter. Stop chasing the unknown element, hold what they had. That told Logan something important. They still had something worth holding. He thought about who might still be on the upper floors. He'd reached people through the intercom on floors 28 through 36, but the intercom's range was inconsistent. Older panels on some floors might not have received transmission, or people in interior offices might not have been near a panel when he broadcast. Above the 36th floor was where the executive team's offices concentrated, which meant the people most likely to still be up there were the ones who had the smallest conference rooms with the heaviest doors and the instinct to lock themselves inside and wait for someone else to fix the problem. He also thought about the fact that Control had said, "Hold what we have," which implied they had something specific, someone, more likely. Someone they'd moved from a floor they'd searched to somewhere more defensible. He changed direction. He stopped going down and started going up. The 38th floor had been cleared. He could tell by the way the doors sat. Several of them showed the specific damage of a forced entry, lock mechanisms torqued hard by someone who hadn't wanted to wait, and the contents of 2 offices had been disturbed in the pattern of a rapid search rather than a thorough one. They'd swept it fast looking for people and moved on, which meant they hadn't found anyone here, which meant whoever was still in the building had either gotten out through routes the mercenaries didn't know existed or had made it to a floor above or below their sweep line. He found the first one on the 39th floor. A man wedged inside a server closet in the IT department, sitting with his knees against his chest and his phone in his hands, not calling anyone because there was no signal, but holding it anyway like the physical weight of it was keeping him anchored. He was maybe 60, with the look of someone who had worked in IT long enough to regard most crises as software problems, and was finding this particular crisis resistant to that framework. Logan eased the closet door open and the man flinched so hard he nearly knocked a server off its bracket. "Hey," Logan said quietly. "Logan Hayes, building maintenance. You okay?" The man stared at him, then at the blood on his sleeve, then back at his face. Is it over?" "Not yet." Logan scanned the corridor behind him, confirmed it was still clear. "Can you move?" Yes, I can move." The man unfolded himself from the closet with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been in one position long enough that his joints had opinions about it. "There's someone else. 2 floors up. I heard a woman's voice about an hour ago through the ventilation duct, and then it stopped, and I don't—" 2 floors up is 41, Logan said. She said her name. I couldn't hear the last name, but her first name was Diane. Logan cataloged it and made a decision. "I'm going to move you to the 38th floor server room first. You'll stay there until you hear 3 knocks, then 2, then 3. Don't open for anything else. Can you remember that? 323, the man said, with the specific precision of someone who processed information through repetition. Yes, 323. What's your name? Gerald. Gerald Marsh, IT Infrastructure. Gerald, follow me and stay low. The 41st floor was where he found the rest of what the operation had been building toward, and it changed everything he thought he understood about why any of this had happened. He came through the maintenance corridor access on 41 and stopped. The corridor was not empty. At the far end, near the door to the executive boardroom, a room Logan had been in exactly once, to replace a projector mount, and which he remembered as the kind of room designed to communicate that decisions made inside it were not available for discussion. Two men stood in a posture that was not searching but guarding. Facing inward, weapons held ready but not raised, which meant there was something behind that door they were protecting rather than hunting. Logan pressed back into the maintenance access and thought. He ran the radio again. The chatter had gone quieter still, a sign that whatever was happening now was known only to a smaller subset of people, which in operational terms meant it was the core of the whole thing. The flat voice of control said something brief that Logan caught only partially. Confirm the package is secured. Await extraction confirmation. Package. He thought about the acquisition, the Ardent Technologies deal, the signing that was supposed to happen at 1 p.m. $12 billion changing hands, or rather, the agreements that would govern how $12 billion and the companies attached to it would be restructured. He thought about what Victoria had said to him on the 43rd floor. The most important acquisition in company history, and about the way she'd said it, with the flat factuality of someone who had been living inside that sentence for months. He thought about who stood to lose something if that acquisition completed. And then he thought about the word insiders, which was the word that kept surfacing in his peripheral assessment of the situation without him having had enough information to attach it to anything concrete. Until now. He went back to Gerald in the server room, retrieved his tool bag, and took out the copper wire and the multimeter and three things that were not, on their own, anything a person would describe as a weapon. Then he went to find another way into the boardroom. What? The HVAC access panel behind the boardroom's east wall was 22 inches wide, which was not comfortable but was possible, and Logan had been through tighter approaches in conditions that made a 41-floor air duct seem like a courtesy. He moved through it slowly, in absolute silence, until he was positioned above the return vent that looked down into the boardroom from the ceiling. What he saw through the vent's slats reorganized the entire situation into something uglier and more specific than a kidnapping. Victoria was in the room. She was seated at the head of the boardroom table, the particular chair that was, by architectural intention, the most prominent position in the room, with her wrists zip-tied to the armrests and her expression doing something complicated that Logan, watching from above, read as a woman running her full processing power on a problem while keeping her face as neutral as she could manage. She was not visibly injured. She was not crying. She was doing what Logan had begun to understand was her fundamental response to impossible situations. Assessing, cataloging, waiting for the variable that would shift the equation. Across the table from her sat a man Logan didn't recognize from building operations, which meant he hadn't come in through maintenance or the lobby or any of the access points Logan monitored as part of his regular rounds. He was perhaps 50, with the specific bearing of someone who had been in rooms where serious decisions were made for long enough that the posture had become permanent. Not military, but adjacent to power in the particular way of men who managed the relationships between money and the people who had it. I was wearing a dark suit that was inconsistent with tactical gear, but consistent with someone who had expected this to resolve before it got complicated. He was holding a tablet. On the tablet screen, Logan could see it partially. The angle was oblique but workable, was what looked like a legal document. Signature fields visible at the bottom. There were two other men in the room, both armed, both positioned near the door. Not the same men who had been outside. These were different, which meant the two outside were an additional layer, which meant whatever was in this room was the most protected element of the entire operation. Logan listened. This is not a conversation we need to keep having, the man in the suit said. His voice was the kind of calm that was constructed rather than felt, built out of practiced control over a thing that would otherwise be visible. The document is straightforward. You signed the Ardent Transfer Clause. The acquisition reroutes through the Cayman holding structure instead of the direct acquisition model, and your company continues to function. Your people go home. Victoria looked at him. And you walk away with operational control of Ardent through a shell company that doesn't appear anywhere in the original deal terms. The terminology is, "You're stealing it," she said, with no heat, just precision. You've spent 6 months building the acquisition so that when I signed, you'd already positioned the extraction vehicle. You just needed me to not notice the Cayman insertion until after the close. A pause. Which I did notice. That's what my lawyers flagged last night. The man was quiet for a moment. Which is why we're here, she said. Logan, watching from above, felt something settle into place. The 2 clauses Victoria's legal team had flagged overnight. The reason the signing hadn't already happened. The reason this operation existed at all. Not to kidnap the CEO of Mercer Global, not to hold the company hostage for ransom, but to get one signature under conditions where no one would be looking at the fine print because the CEO was terrified and surrounded by armed men. He thought about who had the access to know what those flagged clauses contained, who had known the deal was about to fall apart before it closed, who had arranged for mercenaries to be in position this morning at exactly the moment a signing was scheduled to happen. He thought about the word insiders again, and this time it had names attached to it, though he didn't know those names yet. What he knew was that they were people who had been inside Victoria's operation long enough to build this infrastructure around her without her seeing it, and that they were people who had access to the kind of resources that funded a professional mercenary team, and that they were people who were, right now, waiting for a phone call that would tell them the problem had been solved. He started moving backward through the duct toward the access panel. Victoria's voice followed him, steady and cold as a filing cabinet. "I'm not signing anything." The man in the suit said quietly, "Yes, you are." Logan came out of the duct access, reassembled what he had from his tool bag, and gave himself 45 seconds to think about what he was about to do. Not the tactics. The tactics were workable. He'd operated in worse ratios with less preparation. But the fact of it. The part that wasn't tactics. He was a maintenance worker at a company that had fired him this morning. He was a single father whose son was currently in school 20 minutes from this building. He had spent 2 years building something quiet and sustainable and deliberately small. A life that asked nothing of the person he'd been in the years before it. And that person was now standing in an HVAC access corridor on the 41st floor of a building full of armed mercenaries with a tool bag and a length of copper wire and a cut on his arm that had reopened sometime in the last hour. He thought about what he'd told Victoria on the parking structure roof. Because there are still people under desks. She was under a desk now, metaphorically, tied to the most important chair in her own building, being pressured to sign away the things she'd built for 7 years by men who'd been inside her organization long enough to know exactly where to cut. He picked up the radio. He switched to the channel he'd been monitoring and pressed transmit once, briefly, and said, "You're going to want to pull your boardroom detail. I've got your 2 external guards, and I'm about to come through the door." He released transmit. He counted to 5. Static. Then the flat voice of the man in the suit, which told Logan the suit was carrying a command radio and was therefore more than a lawyer or a financial architect. "Who is this?" "The maintenance man," Logan said. He put the radio in his pocket, picked up the only thing from his tool bag that was unambiguously a weapon, the compact submachine gun he'd taken from the man on the 29th floor landing, which he'd carried since then without using because having it and not needing it was better than needing it and not having it, and walked to the boardroom door. The 2 external guards had moved. He'd expected that. The radio transmission was a provocation designed to do exactly that, to shift attention from the door to the corridor, because men in guard positions hearing an unknown element announce itself would pull toward the corridor threat rather than the room interior. One had gone left toward the stairwell. One had gone right toward the maintenance access. Neither had gone to the door itself, because the door was behind them, and people don't guard what they assume is already protected. Logan came through the boardroom door. The 2 men inside had their weapons raised and pointed at the door before it finished opening, which was correct. What they hadn't accounted for was that he came through low and moving laterally, not in the center of the frame where they'd been aiming, and the room's configuration, long table, high-backed chairs, presentation screen on the far wall creating a secondary reflection that confused depth perception from certain angles, was a room Logan had been inside before and they hadn't. What followed was not clean. It was not the kind of thing that happened in films where the trained person moves through opposition with balletic precision and everyone ends up exactly where they're supposed to be. One of the armed men got a forearm into Logan's face before Logan brought him down, and it was solid contact, the kind that would become a bruise by tomorrow and an ache by tonight. The other man was more of a problem, bigger, faster to recover, and he'd had training that went beyond the basic operator level, because the sequence he ran when Logan closed on him was not a reaction, it was a counter, and it worked partially. Logan took a knee to the ribs that bent his breathing for a few seconds and had to use the table to get back to something functional. He got there. Both men were on the floor, zip-tied, his last set, which meant no more of that particular tool, and Logan was leaning against the boardroom table with his hand pressed against his ribs and his breathing shorter than he wanted it to be. Victoria was watching him from the executive chair, her wrists still bound to the armrests. The man in the suit had not moved. He was standing at the far end of the table with his hands at his sides and an expression that was the expression of a man reevaluating a situation at a fundamental level. His radio was on the table in front of him. He had not reached for it. Logan straightened, crossed to Victoria, cut the zip ties with the folding blade, one side, then the other. She pulled her hands free and sat for a moment, rubbing her wrists, and there was something in that motion, the small, ordinary pain of returning circulation, that was more humanizing than anything else Logan had seen from her since the 43rd floor. She looked at the man in the suit, put the tablet on the table. The man set it down. Step back. He stepped back. Victoria stood, pulled the tablet toward her, and looked at the document on the screen for about 30 seconds. Logan watched the man in the suit while she read, and the man in the suit watched Logan with the calculating stillness of someone who was not yet done trying to find the exit from a situation that had closed around him. "Marcus Hale," Victoria said. She said it the way you say a name when you're confirming something you already know and had hoped was wrong. Logan filed the name. "You've been on my board for 4 years," she said. "You were in the room when we structured the Ardent deal. You saw every version of the acquisition model." Marcus Hale said nothing. "The Cayman structure was yours," she said. "You proposed it as an efficiency vehicle in the second quarter last year. I approved it for a different transaction. You kept the entity active." Still nothing. "How many of them?" she asked. "On my board." "How many new?" Hale looked at her for a moment. Then, with the specific flatness of a man who has decided that the situation is lost and is choosing how to be present inside that loss. 3. Victoria absorbed this. Logan watched her absorb it. The particular stillness of someone receiving information that restructures a significant portion of their understanding of their own life. 3 people she had worked with, trusted at the level that board membership implies trust, who had looked at everything she'd built and seen it primarily as something to take. "The mercenaries are yours," Logan said to Hale. Not a question. Hale looked at him. "The operation was contracted through a third party." "That's not what I asked." A pause. "Ultimately, yes." Logan nodded once. He looked at the radio on the table, then at Hale. "Call control. Tell them the operation is complete. Tell them to stand down and withdraw." Hale blinked. "If I tell them that, they'll leave." Logan held his gaze. "Which is what you want right now, because federal law enforcement has been outside this building for the past 40 minutes. He didn't actually know this, but the timeline suggested it was probable, given that 31 civilians with working cell phones had reached street level over an hour ago. And you would rather they withdraw than be apprehended inside an active hostage situation, because the difference between what you're facing right now and what you'd be facing if they're caught on site with weapons is a substantial number of years." Hale looked at him for a long moment, then at Victoria, then back at Logan. He picked up the radio and called control. The next 7 minutes were the longest 7 minutes Logan had spent since leaving the military, which was a considerable statement. He stood at the boardroom door and listened to the building reorganize around the order to withdraw, which happened with the same disciplined efficiency as the original assault, methodically, without panic, which told him the mercenaries were professional enough to execute an exit cleanly, even from a compromised operation. He heard the external guards pass the boardroom door without stopping, moving toward the stairwell in the particular cadence of men who are no longer interested in anything inside the room they're passing. He heard the building go quiet. Not the false quiet of controlled operation, the real quiet of a structure in which the thing that had been moving through it had stopped. Victoria sat at the boardroom table with Hale's tablet in front of her, and Hale zip-tied to a chair across from her. Logan's blade had found one final use, and she was looking at the document on the screen with an expression that had come through something and was still sorting itself out on the other side. "He's not going anywhere," Logan said. "I know." She didn't look up from the tablet. "I'm reading the insertion clause." "You don't have to do that right now." "Yes, I do." She turned the tablet slightly and looked at the subsection that her lawyers had flagged, and then looked at it again, and Logan could see on her face the particular thing that happens when a person finds the exact mechanism of their own betrayal written out in legal language. That moment of understanding so specific it almost becomes physical. "It's 47, she said. "The whole thing. 47 words buried in a subsection of a secondary agreement." She set the tablet down. 4 years. "He's been on my board for 4 years." Logan had nothing useful to say to that, and so he didn't say anything. He stood at the door and watched the corridor and listened to the building and thought about Caleb, because the alternative was thinking about his ribs, which were doing something he'd address later. "Logan." He turned. She was looking at him, not with the expression she'd been building since the 43rd floor. That one had resolved into something else now, something that had gotten there through everything that had happened in the past several hours and had come out the other side looking like it had earned the right to be whatever it was. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Don't thank me yet. We're still on the 41st floor." Something crossed her face, somewhere between exasperated and something warmer, and she almost smiled, and then didn't quite, and the not quite of it was more human than either option would have been. "Can we at least start going down?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go down. Passons." The lobby was lit by afternoon sun cutting through the glass facade at an angle that turned the marble floor into something that looked briefly like water. Federal agents had come through the main entrance, and there were more in the plaza outside, and the building had been divided into sectors by people with identification and earpieces who moved through it with the organized urgency of a system that had been activated and was now running at full capacity. Logan and Victoria came down the main stairwell to the lobby with Marcus Hale between them. Logan with a hand on Hale's arm, Victoria 2 steps ahead, her shoes back on now because she'd put them on somewhere around the 35th floor, and Logan hadn't noticed until the 33rd and hadn't commented on it. And the federal agents in the lobby stopped what they were doing when they came through the stairwell door. A woman in a dark jacket with a federal badge on her belt looked at Logan the way people looked at situations that were outside their prepared categories. Her eyes went to the cut on his arm, the blood on his sleeve, the submachine gun held loose at his side, the general condition of a man who had spent 5 hours inside a building full of armed mercenaries, and then went to Victoria Sinclair, who she clearly recognized, and then back to Logan. "Who are you?" the agent asked. Logan set the submachine gun on the lobby desk with the care of someone who was very aware of what he was doing and wanted that awareness to be visible. "Logan Hayes," he said. "Building maintenance." The agent looked at him for a beat that was slightly longer than a standard processing pause. "There's a man named Gerald Marsh in the 38th floor server room," Logan said. "Combination is 3 knocks, 2, 3. He's been there for about 2 hours. He's okay, but he's probably ready to come out." He looked at the lobby. "I left some people zip-tied to things in the stairwells. They should probably be dealt with." "How many?" the agent said. Logan thought about it. 7, 8, including the one in the boardroom. "He's the one you want to talk to first. Marcus Hale, board member. He was running the inside operation." He paused. "The mercenaries are contracted through a third party. Hale can give you the connection. He will, because it's his best option." The agent was looking at him with an expression that was equal parts professional composure and the human version of what is happening right now. "Mr. Hayes, can I ask what your background is?" Logan looked at her. He thought about how long it had been since that question came with a complicated answer, and about how much had changed in the past 5 hours, and about the way some things, once brought back to the surface, are not going back down easily. "Navy," he said. "I was Navy." She held his gaze for a moment, then she looked at the submachine gun on the lobby desk, and at the door to the stairwell, and at Victoria Sinclair standing in the lobby of her own building with her blazer smudged, and her expression looking like a person who has come through something and is still determining what that something cost. "Okay," the agent said. "I'm going to need you to stay in the building for a while." "I need to make a phone call first," Logan said. She studied him. "My son," he said. "He doesn't know where I am." Something shifted in her face. She stepped aside and gestured toward the lobby exit, and he walked through it into the late afternoon light, and behind him the building was already in the process of becoming what it would be for the rest of its life. The building where this had happened, the building that had been held, and then recovered, and then investigated, and then reported on, and then absorbed into the long record of events that people would reference and eventually forget. Outside, the air was different. It was just air, normal September air, with car exhaust, and the distant sound of the city going about its business, with complete indifference to what had happened inside 43 floors of glass and steel. But it felt different on his face after 5 hours of recycled building air and adrenaline and the specific internal climate of a structure that had been, briefly, a battlefield. He sat down on the plaza steps, not because he needed to, but because his ribs asked him to, firmly, and dialed the school. The secretary picked up on the second ring. "This is Logan Hayes," he said. "Caleb Hayes, 3rd grade. I'm calling to confirm pickup today. I'll be a little late." He paused. "Can you tell him his dad called? Tell him I'll be there." He sat on the steps and looked at the plaza, at the black vehicles that were not parked at angles anymore, at the people moving in and out of the building with clipboards and evidence bags, and the particular purposeful exhaustion of people who had arrived after the crisis and were now managing the long tail of it. He put the phone in his pocket. The cut on his arm had dried. His ribs would need looking at. I was going to have to answer a substantial number of questions before he went anywhere, and the answers to those questions were going to open doors into the part of his life he'd kept closed for 2 years. And he wasn't ready for that, and it was happening anyway. He looked up at the building. 43 floors, all the glass. The sky reflected in it, turning the late afternoon into something that looked, from down here, almost peaceful. He thought about Caleb's face, the laughing, the ridiculous thing about orange juice making things stronger. He needed to get home. He didn't get home until nearly 10 o'clock that night. The federal debriefing lasted 4 hours, conducted in a mobile command unit parked on the north side of the plaza by an agent named Carla Reyes, who had the specific patience of someone who had learned that the best way to get complete information from a person who was reluctant to give it was to simply wait them out. She wasn't unkind about it. She brought him coffee at the 2-hour mark without asking if he wanted it, which he appreciated, and she didn't react visibly when his service record came up on her screen, except to look at it for a moment longer than she'd looked at anything else. "Classified operations 2009 through 2019, she said, not reading from the screen but confirming against it. 3 deployments you can't discuss, and 4 you can. 11 commendations, separated voluntarily." She looked up. "It says here the separation was..." "It just says personal circumstances." "Yes." "You want to explain that?" "Not especially." He looked at his coffee. "It's not relevant to what happened today." Reyes considered this. "It's relevant to how you did what you did today. The how isn't personal circumstances. The why is." He met her eyes. "My son lost his mother when he was 3. I decided I was going to be there for him instead of being somewhere else. That's the whole story." She looked at him for a moment, then wrote something in her notes and moved on, which was the correct response, and which told him she was good at her job. By the time she was done with him, the plaza had thinned to a residual presence. A few vehicles, a crime scene boundary still in place across the main entrance. The kind of institutional aftermath that would continue for days in the form of investigators and evidence technicians and people with cameras from the building's insurance carrier. The mercenaries who'd been apprehended inside, 4 of them, the ones Logan had zip-tied and the 2 who hadn't made the withdrawal in time, were in federal custody. Marcus Hale was in a different kind of federal custody, the kind that came with a separate vehicle and a conversation with people who had jurisdiction over financial crimes in addition to the more straightforward crimes of tonight. Reyes told Logan he'd need to come back tomorrow for a follow-up session, and possibly again the day after. She told him his service record would be referenced in the investigation and that certain elements of it might become part of the public record, which she said with a particular care that acknowledged it was information rather than a warning. She gave him a card and told him to call if he thought of anything else. He took the card and walked to his truck, which was in the employee parking structure on the building's west side, and which had a parking ticket on the windshield from the city enforcement officer who had apparently continued doing their job throughout the entire event, which Logan found darkly funny in a way he couldn't fully articulate. He drove to Caleb's school. The aftercare program was still technically running. They'd extended hours given the circumstances. The school had received enough calls from parents delayed by the city's response to the Mercer Global situation that they'd kept the lights on. And Caleb was in the gymnasium with 4 other kids and a tired aide playing some version of a card game that Caleb had apparently invented the rules to, because the rules were, as the aide explained to Logan when he arrived, changing approximately every 10 minutes. Caleb looked up from his cards and saw his father in the doorway, and the look on his face was the most uncomplicated thing Logan had seen all day. He crossed the gymnasium floor at a speed that was not quite running because the rule was no running in the gym, and Caleb was a kid who followed rules right up to the edge of them, and then leaned. He hit Logan at approximately the height of Logan's sternum, which was directly adjacent to the rib that was probably cracked, and Logan didn't make a sound about it. He just put his arms around his son and held on. "You smell weird," Caleb said, into his shirt. "It was a long day." "Mrs. Patterson said there was something at your building on the news." "There was." Caleb pulled back and looked up at him with the particular intensity of an 8-year-old conducting an assessment. He looked at the dried cut on Logan's forearm, which was visible below the rolled sleeve. He looked at the bruise that was developing along Logan's jaw from the forearm contact on the 41st floor. He looked at his father's face. "Are you okay?" he asked, very directly, with none of the hedging that adults put around that question. Logan looked at his son. "Yeah, buddy, I'm okay." Caleb studied him for another second. Then he nodded once with a seriousness that was so specifically Logan's own mannerism that it almost hurt to see it, and said, "Can we get drive-through on the way home? I didn't really eat my lunch." "Yeah," Logan said. "We can do that." The drive-through was a burger place 2 blocks from their apartment, and Caleb ate his food in the back seat with the particular focused silence of a kid who had been holding on all day and was now, in the specific safety of his father's truck, allowing himself to simply be hungry and tired and 8 years old. Logan ate his own food in the parking lot before he started driving because his hands needed something to do and because he hadn't eaten since 6 in the morning, and his body was making its position on that very clear. At home, Caleb brushed his teeth and changed into his pajamas and wanted to know if Logan would sit with him for a while, which Logan did, on the edge of the narrow bed with the star-patterned sheets that Caleb had picked out himself 18 months ago and still refused to upgrade from despite having outgrown the stars are cool phase by at least 6 months. "Dad," Caleb said from somewhere near the edge of sleep. "Yeah." "The thing on the news, were you scared?" Logan thought about the stairwell, about the 33rd floor corridor, about the feeling in his body when he'd gone back across the mechanical bridge alone. "Sometimes," he said. "A little bit." "Yeah." Caleb processed this. "But you did it anyway." "Had to." "Because of the people inside." "Yeah." Another silence, the specific weighted silence of a child working something out. "Is that why you left the Navy? Because you were scared?" Logan looked at him, at his son's face in the hall light coming through the cracked door, serious and open, asking the question because it was on his mind, and Caleb had not yet learned that there were questions adults preferred not to answer directly. "No," Logan said. "I left because I wasn't scared enough. About the right things." He paused. "About you." Caleb looked at him for a moment. Then he rolled slightly toward the wall in the way that meant he was done talking and ready to sleep, and said, "Okay," and was unconscious within 4 minutes. Logan sat on the edge of the bed for a while after that. The days that followed were loud in ways Logan had not prepared for. The story broke fully by the following morning. Not just the hostage situation at Mercer Global, but the internal conspiracy behind it, the board members involved, the sophisticated financial fraud embedded in the Ardent Technologies acquisition structure. It was the kind of story that had enough components to sustain coverage for weeks. Corporate betrayal, a billionaire CEO held at gunpoint, a shadow mercenary operation funded through offshore accounts. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a 37-year-old maintenance worker with a classified military service record who had apparently dismantled the entire operation from the inside using a tool bag and 11 years of institutional knowledge about a building's secondary systems. The federal agents asked him not to do media, which suited him precisely. He answered their questions over the follow-up sessions. 2 more full debriefings, one of which included a man from a federal intelligence office who didn't introduce his agency and whose interest in Logan's methods was more academic than investigative. And he picked Caleb up from school every day and made dinner every night and lived as much as he could inside the ordinary rhythms of the life he'd built. The Ardent deal was suspended pending investigation, which was inevitable. 3 members of the Mercer Global Board were arrested within 72 hours of the incident: Marcus Hale and 2 others whose names Logan learned from the news rather than from anyone directly involved in the case. A 4th member who had known about the plan but claimed not to have been an active participant became the investigation's primary cooperative witness, which Reyes mentioned to Logan on his 3rd debriefing session in a tone that suggested she found it professionally distasteful but tactically useful. He received a message from Victoria's office on the 3rd day asking if he would be available to meet. He said yes and gave a time that worked around Caleb's school schedule, and then spent approximately no time thinking about what the meeting would be about, because the alternative was to think about it constantly, and he'd learned a long time ago that the anticipation of difficult conversations was almost always worse than the conversations themselves. The meeting was not in Mercer Global Tower. He'd expected that, or something like it. The building was still partially restricted while forensic work continued. And in any case, the idea of Victoria Sinclair holding the meeting in her own boardroom had a kind of tonal incorrectness to it given what had happened in that room. Instead, her assistant, Priya, who Logan had last seen crouched under a desk on the 43rd floor, and who seemed, from the brief phone call to arrange the logistics, to be doing the specific kind of okay that people do when they've come through something and are determined to function, directed him to a smaller office space in a building 6 blocks south that Mercer Global maintained for satellite operations. Victoria was there when he arrived, standing at the window with a coffee cup in her hand, and she turned when he came in with an expression that was different from any of the expressions he'd cataloged during the event itself. The constructing and the assessing and the controlled stillness under pressure were all still there in the architecture of her face, but they were quieter now, sitting underneath something else, something that had come through the past 72 hours and hadn't been polished back into professional shape yet. She looked, Logan thought, like a person who had not been sleeping well. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Sure." He sat in the offered chair across the desk, and she sat across from him, and for a moment neither of them said anything, which was not uncomfortable exactly, but was the specific texture of 2 people who had been through something together that had no standard social script attached to it. "How are your ribs?" she asked. He'd mentioned the ribs in passing during one of the debriefing sessions, and apparently that had made its way to her through the investigation documentation. "1 cracked, 2 bruised. It's fine." "It doesn't sound fine." "It's manageable." He looked at her. "How are you?" The question clearly landed somewhere slightly unexpected for her from the brief shift in her expression. He guessed she'd been asked some version of it many times in the past 3 days, and had gotten skilled at deflecting it with the language of operational recovery. "The company is working through the implications. Our priority is our employees. The legal process is underway." He hadn't asked any of those things. She stopped. Started again. "I'm not great, honestly. I keep thinking about the document, the 47 words." She set her coffee cup down. "I approved that Cayman entity a year ago. I signed off on Marcus Hale's proposal. I thought I understood what I was approving. You approved a financial vehicle for a different transaction. I should have seen what it could become." "You were running a $12 billion acquisition," Logan said. "You can't track every entity through every possible future misuse." "I'm supposed to be good at that kind of thing." "You are good at that kind of thing. Your lawyers flagged it in the secondary review. That's why the signing didn't happen on schedule." He paused. "That's why the operation existed, because you were too careful." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a generous reading." "It's an accurate one." He looked at her steadily. "They needed to force the signature because they couldn't get it any other way. Because your process was working." She absorbed this with the particular care of someone who wanted to believe it, but was going to require more convincing before they let themselves. It was a very human thing to watch. He thought she probably didn't know how much of it was visible on her face. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer it honestly, not diplomatically." Okay. Why did you go back in? After you got everyone out, after me? She held his gaze. You were free. You were outside the building. Whatever legal situation you were in from the firing was already, no one was going to pursue that. You could have just, no, he said. I couldn't. Why not? He thought about how to say it in a way that was true without being more than he wanted to put in a room with someone he'd known for a total of, in accumulated real conversation time, maybe 3 hours. When you're trained the way I was trained, he said, you learn that the mission doesn't end at extraction. Extraction is a milestone, not an endpoint. You get one person out and then you go back for the next one. You do that until there's no one left. He paused. I know that sounds like something from a recruitment video, but it's just how you're wired after enough years of it. You don't make a calculation about it. You just go back. Gerald Marsh, she said. He told me you found him in a server closet on the 39th floor and that you talked to him like he was a person having a bad day rather than someone who had been hiding in a cabinet for an hour and a half. Logan remembered Gerald with his knees folded to his chest and his phone in his hand like a talisman. He was scared. People who are scared need to be spoken to like they're capable of handling the next step. Otherwise, they freeze. Is that training too? He considered. Some of it. Some of it's just, you get to an age where you understand that most people are doing the best they can with what they have. Treating them like that usually brings out more of what they have. Victoria looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at her coffee cup and at the desk and appeared to make a decision of some kind. I want to offer you a position, she said. Not your old position, something different. Logan waited. Director of Corporate Security. Rebuilding the entire division from structure up. New protocols, new personnel standards, new risk assessment frameworks. She looked at him directly. The division Garrett ran, my previous head of security, who was incapacitated in the initial breach, it wasn't built for this kind of threat. It was built for a company that thought its risks were disgruntled ex-employees and industrial espionage. We need something different now, and I need someone who thinks the way you think. Logan was quiet for a moment. The compensation would be significant, she said, and named a number that was several orders of magnitude above his maintenance salary, which he'd expected and which was not the thing he was thinking about. I need to ask you something first, he said. Ask. My son, he's 8. He's in school 20 minutes from here. I drop him off in the morning. I pick him up in the afternoon. I'm home for dinner. He held her gaze. That's the non-negotiable. Not, I'll try to make it work. Not, within reason. That's the floor. Everything else builds from there, or it doesn't. She looked at him for a moment. He had the sense that she was doing what she did, cataloging and assessing, but that what she was looking at this time was not a problem to solve, but a person to understand. What's his name? She asked. Caleb. How long have you been doing it alone, raising him? 5 years. She nodded slowly. Something was happening in her expression that was not the controlled professional composure and was not the constructing under pressure face from the building. It was something quieter than either. Caleb's schedule doesn't move, she said. That's a condition of the role. I'll have it written into the contract. He looked at her. He believed her, which surprised him slightly, not because she seemed dishonest, but because he had not expected to believe anyone that quickly about something that mattered that much. Okay, he said. Okay? I'll take the role. She exhaled. It was small, barely perceptible, but it was the exhale of someone who had been holding something and had set it down. I'll have legal draft the terms. He stood. She stood. They looked at each other across the desk with the slightly awkward recognition of two people who have shared an extreme experience and are now in a conference room in a satellite office on a Thursday afternoon. Logan, she said. He stopped. I owe you an apology. For the firing. She said it with none of the corporate language of formal accountability. No on behalf of the organization, or I regret any misunderstanding. Just the fact of it, direct and slightly uncomfortable the way real apologies are. I was dismissive. I made a judgment about you based on something that was essentially irrelevant, and I was wrong. He looked at her for a moment. You fixed a management problem the way you understood management worked at the time. That's generous. It's accurate, he said. Same as what I said about the Cayman entity. Accurate isn't the same as generous. She considered this. Then, you do that a lot. Do what? Reframe things. You take something that should be criticism and you put it in a context where it becomes just information, something to work with. He thought about it. Probably. It's more useful than the alternative. What's the alternative? Sitting with it until it becomes a story about yourself that isn't true. He picked up his jacket from the chair. I've done that enough to know it doesn't get you anywhere. He walked to the door. Tell Caleb, she said behind him, that the new security director says orange juice makes things stronger. He turned. She was looking at him with an expression that was, for the first time since he'd known her, simply unguarded. Not performing competence, not managing a situation, not processing under the surface of a controlled face. Just a woman in a satellite office on a Thursday who had almost lost everything she'd built and hadn't, and who was, in the particular quiet that comes after near disasters, starting to understand what she actually wanted the next part of her life to look like. He stared at her. How do you know about that? Gerald Marsh is very thorough in his incident report. Logan shook his head, slowly, at the ceiling. He left. The weeks that followed had the texture of reconstruction. Not dramatic, not clean, but the genuine article. The slow rebuilding of a thing from its actual foundations, rather than from the story of what it used to be. The Mercer Global Board was restructured. 4 members resigned in the wake of the investigation, 2 of them proactively, before they were formally implicated, which their legal teams had clearly advised as the better strategy. And Victoria spent most of November in what she described to Logan, in one of the working sessions that became a regular feature of his first month, as the least comfortable conversations of my professional life, replacing people she'd trusted with people she could verify, which was a different and harder standard. Logan built the new security division the way he'd been trained to build operational structures, from the threat model outward. He started with a comprehensive assessment of the building's physical vulnerabilities, which took 11 days and which produced a document that made the previous facilities manager visibly uncomfortable when Logan presented it. He hired his first 2 staff members in December, a former federal agent named Darnell, who had the specific quality of someone who was alert to human behavior in ways that cameras couldn't replicate, and a woman named Ewan who had spent a decade in cybersecurity and who looked at the building's digital infrastructure and said, with the flat effect of someone delivering a medical diagnosis, "This is not good. We have a lot of work to do." They had a lot of work to do. Logan arrived at the building at 7:30 most mornings, which was before most of the executive floor was in, and left at 4, which was in time to reach Caleb's school before the final bell. He ate lunch at his desk 3 days out of 5, and at the small Thai place 2 blocks from the building, the other 2, sometimes with Darnell, occasionally alone. He went to Caleb's school events and his soccer games on Saturday mornings and helped with the homework that was getting complicated enough that Logan had to actually concentrate, which was a development he hadn't anticipated but found he didn't mind. He thought about the version of himself that had walked into the 43rd floor HR office and sat across from Deborah and listened to the language of termination with the sound of 2 men moving a freight cart toward a service elevator running in the background of his attention, and the version of himself that was here now, in this office, building something. They were the same person, which was a thing he sometimes needed to remind himself. Not because the reminder was comforting, it wasn't always, but because it was true. And the truth of it was more useful than either a story of transformation or a story of damage. Victoria came by the security office on the 28th floor. Logan had chosen that floor for the division because of the building's structural layout and the access it gave to the monitoring systems, and not at all, consciously, because it was where the maintenance corridor had been that he'd used to move the first group of people toward the north exit. 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes for substantive reasons, and sometimes, he noticed, just to see what was happening. She had the habit of standing in the doorway for a moment before saying anything, as if the act of arriving somewhere and pausing had become a practice she'd developed recently and was finding useful. She and Caleb met for the first time on a Saturday in mid-November when Logan had had to bring him to the office for a few hours because the sitter had canceled and there was a security assessment that couldn't be rescheduled. Caleb sat at the spare desk in the corner with his homework and his headphones and his general 8-year-old self-containment, and Victoria had come by the office and stopped in the doorway and looked at him for a moment before looking at Logan. "He has your posture," she said, quietly enough that Caleb didn't hear. Logan looked at his son, who was sitting very straight with his pencil moving steadily across a math worksheet. Unfortunately, she almost laughed. There was a warmth in it, not performed, not the warmth of someone who was good with children in a professional context, but the warmth of someone who was being surprised by something and letting that surprise be visible. She crossed to the spare desk. "Hi, I'm Victoria." Caleb pulled one headphone off. He looked at her with the direct, slightly unfiltered assessment of someone who had not yet learned to pretend he wasn't evaluating a new person. "You're the CEO," he said. "My dad saved your life." Logan closed his eyes briefly. Victoria looked at Caleb with an expression that was trying to hold several things at once. "He did," she said. "He's very good at his job. He said he's doing a new job now." "He is. He's making sure the building is safer." She looked at the math worksheet. "What are you working on?" "Fractions." Caleb looked at her. "Do you know fractions?" "I know fractions." He slid the worksheet toward her without ceremony. "I don't get this part." Victoria pulled the spare chair over, sat down beside him, and looked at the problem. Logan watched her look at it with the same focused attention she brought to acquisition documents and security assessments, and then explain it to Caleb in language that was direct and concrete and not the least bit condescending. And Caleb nodded and picked up his pencil and worked the problem and got it right on the first try, and looked up at her with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been given a useful tool. "Thanks," he said. With the economy of an 8-year-old who has gotten what he needed and is ready to continue. "Any time," she said. And she meant it, which was something Logan could hear in the word the way he could hear most things in people's voices if he paid attention, which he always did. She stood, caught Logan's eye across the office, and something passed between them that was neither of them saying anything about what had just happened, because neither of them needed to. The investigation resolved in pieces, the way these things always did. The contracted mercenary operation was traced to a security consulting firm operating out of 3 jurisdictions, and the individuals who had assembled and deployed the team were identified and charged through a process that Logan followed in the briefings Reyes kept him updated on, but which he did not allow himself to track obsessively, because obsessing over outcomes he couldn't influence was a habit he'd worked hard to break. Marcus Hale pleaded not guilty through his attorneys, and then, by February, instructed those attorneys to negotiate, which Reyes had predicted on the day of the event, and which Logan had thought about since with a certain respect for her predictive accuracy. The 2 other board members who had been actively involved received separate charges, separate counsel, separate outcomes in progress. The 4th member, the cooperative witness, provided information that unwound the financial architecture of the conspiracy sufficiently that the Ardent Technologies acquisition could be restructured, this time cleanly, with a different transaction model, under the oversight of a board that Victoria had rebuilt with people she'd vetted with a thoroughness that her previous process, she acknowledged in one of the working sessions, had not included. The Ardent deal closed in January. No fanfare, no announcement beyond the required regulatory filings. Logan was in his office on the 28th floor when it happened, and heard about it from Ewan, who had heard about it from Priya, who had sent a brief text that said simply done. He looked at his calendar, saw that Caleb had soccer in 40 minutes, and started packing up his desk. He passed Victoria in the corridor on the way to the elevator. She was holding her phone and she looked like someone who had just put something down that had been very heavy for a very long time. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. They stood in the corridor for a moment. "Caleb has soccer," he said. "Go." She said it without any performance of magnanimity. Just the simple fact, the condition of the role honored without ceremony, because it had been written in and she had meant it when she wrote it. He pressed the elevator button. The doors opened. "Logan," she said. He turned. She looked at him across the corridor with an expression that had been a long time in the building. Months of working sessions and doorway pauses, and the slow accumulation of one person understanding another person through proximity and attention. And that was not yet finished becoming whatever it was going to be, but that was further along than either of them had named. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." He looked at her for a moment. "Same," he said. He got in the elevator and went to his son's soccer game, where Caleb scored once on a lucky deflection off his shin and celebrated with a level of enthusiasm entirely disproportionate to the contribution, which was exactly right, which was the thing Logan stood on the sideline watching with his hands in his jacket pockets and his cracked rib now healed to a dull memory, and something in his chest that had been very tight for a very long time, sitting a little looser than it used to. Spring came to the city the way it always did. Not all at once, but in arguments, cold mornings giving way to warm afternoons, and then reversing again for a few days, as if the season hadn't fully committed yet. Logan noticed it in the way the light changed on his drive to the building, the angle of it shifting week by week, until one morning in late March, he pulled into the parking structure and realized the sun was already above the adjacent roofline when it used to still be behind it, and that somewhere in the accumulation of ordinary days he had stopped bracing for winter and started expecting something else. 6 months. It had been 6 months since the day a corroded relay coupling and a management decision in a freight cart without a log sticker had converged into the worst and most clarifying day of his adult life outside of active service. 6 months was not a long time in any absolute sense, but it was long enough for a cracked rib to finish healing, long enough for Caleb to have moved through an entire soccer season and into baseball, long enough for Darnell and Ewan to have rebuilt the security division's operational foundation into something that Logan could look at without the specific discomfort of a person who knows how many ways a structure can fail. It was long enough also for certain things to become undeniable. He'd spent a considerable portion of those 6 months not naming what was happening between him and Victoria because naming it would require doing something about it, and doing something about it introduced variables into a situation that was, functionally, working. He was good at his job. She was good at hers. They worked together in a way that was efficient and direct, and underneath the efficiency and directness, increasingly honest in the way that two people become honest with each other when they've seen each other in circumstances that don't allow for performance. He knew, for instance, that she got to the building earlier than anyone on her team knew. She was there by 6:45 most mornings, before the executive floor populated, because she thought better in the quiet, and she'd built the company in quiet, and she hadn't lost that habit even as the company had grown around her. He knew that she kept a photograph in her desk drawer rather than on her desk. He'd seen it once, briefly, when she'd opened the drawer during a working session. A woman who looked enough like Victoria that the relationship was obvious, and that she'd never mentioned it, and that he'd never asked, and that the not asking was a thing he'd done deliberately because it was hers to share or not share. He knew that she asked about Caleb with a specificity that was not conversational courtesy. Not "how's your son" in the way people ask about children when they want to signal warmth without requiring an answer, but actual questions, follow-up questions, questions that indicated she'd retained what he'd told her last time and was building on it. She knew Caleb was struggling with reading comprehension in a way he wasn't struggling with math. She knew his best friend at school was a kid named Darius, who had a dog Caleb was obsessed with. She knew the soccer season had ended with a third-place finish that Caleb regarded as a personal injustice. These were not the things you knew about someone's child because you were being professionally courteous. Logan was aware of all of this and had been for months and had continued, with the particular stubbornness of a man who had organized his life around avoiding variables he couldn't control, to not do anything about it. That changed on a Wednesday afternoon in early April in a way that was not dramatic and not planned and was therefore exactly the way things tended to change when they were real. He'd stayed late, unusual, but Darnell had flagged a gap in the building's eastern perimeter monitoring that needed to be addressed before the vendor access period the following morning, and Logan had stayed to work through the solution. It was past 6 when he finished, past 6:30 when he'd sent the revised protocol to Darnell and closed his computer, and the building had gone quiet around him in the way it went quiet after business hours, the ventilation humming and the distant sound of the cleaning crew on the upper floors and everything else stilled. He was in the elevator when it stopped on the 43rd floor. Victoria got in. She was carrying her jacket over one arm and her bag over the other shoulder, and she had the look of someone who had been in back-to-back meetings since morning and was now in the particular state of exhaustion that comes not from physical depletion, but from hours of being fully, professionally present in ways that don't leave room for anything else. She saw him, and the meeting face fell away, just like that, the same way it had on the parking structure roof 6 months ago, when she'd asked him why he was going back in and actually listened to the answer. "Late night," she said. "Perimeter issue on the east side. You?" "Board dinner." She leaned against the elevator wall. "The new board, which is better than the old board in every measurable way and still somehow exhausting." "Boards are exhausting. Everything is exhausting." She said it without self-pity. Just the flat observation of someone doing an honest inventory. Do you get tired of being capable? He looked at her. What? Being the person who handles things, who fixes things, who goes back into the building. She looked at the elevator ceiling briefly. I've been that person my whole professional life and most of my personal life, and I'm very good at it, and tonight I'm just tired of it, of being the one who holds it together. The elevator reached the lobby. Neither of them moved immediately. Logan thought about what she'd asked. He thought about it honestly, the way he tried to think about most things, without the editorial layer that turns uncomfortable truths into more manageable versions of themselves. Yes, he said. Sometimes. He looked at the elevator doors, which had opened and were now beginning to think about closing. He put his hand out to hold them. You want to get coffee? There's a place 2 blocks south that's still open. She looked at him for a moment. Something moved in her expression. Not surprise exactly, more like someone recognizing a door that had been there for a while and deciding to walk through it. Yeah, she said. I do. The coffee place was mostly empty at that hour, a narrow room with exposed brick and the kind of lighting that was warm without being atmospheric about it. They sat at a corner table and ordered and sat with the first few minutes of silence that people sit with when they've stepped outside the professional context that usually structures their interactions and are finding their footing in what's left. Tell me about her, Logan said. Victoria looked up from her cup. The photograph in your desk, he said. I saw it once. I didn't ask at the time. She was quiet for a moment. Not the controlled stillness, but the genuine pause of someone deciding how honest to be. Then, my mother. She died when I was 22, before any of this. She gestured vaguely, meaning the company, the building, all of it. She never saw any of it. I'm sorry. She would have had opinions about all of it. A small, complicated smile. Mostly about the hours. What was she like? Loud, Victoria said immediately. Funny in the way that people are funny when they're not trying to be. She could walk into a room full of strangers and within 20 minutes know everyone's name and the thing they were most worried about. She looked at her coffee. I got the business brain from my father. I did not get that from her. You're better at it than you think, Logan said. She looked at him. The day after the incident, he said, on the 32nd floor. You sat on the floor with that young woman, the one who was barely holding it together, and you talked to her for 20 minutes. I saw it before I went back across the bridge. He held her gaze. That wasn't a CEO managing a crisis. That was a person sitting with another person. She was quiet for a long moment. I didn't think anyone saw that. I see most things. I know you do. She turned her cup slowly. It's slightly unnerving. I've heard that. She looked at him across the table with the expression that had been building since September. The one that had come through everything and was, finally, just itself. Not processed, not assessed, not managed into something presentable. What do you want, Logan? Not from the job. From just, what do you want? It was a question he hadn't been asked in a long time. Not because the people in his life didn't care, but because the shape of his life had made the answer seem self-evident to everyone around him. He wanted stability, wanted Caleb safe and growing, wanted the quiet life he'd built to remain intact. Those things were true. They were also incomplete. I want Caleb to grow up knowing that his father was present, he said. Not just physically, actually present. He paused. I spent years being somewhere else, even when I was home. That's a thing you carry. I don't want him to carry it. He won't, she said. Anyone who spends 10 minutes around the two of you can see that. And personally, he looked at her steadily. I want to stop treating the things I want as variables to be managed. He let that sit for a moment. That's new. I'm working on it. The corner of her mouth moved. How's it going? Mixed results so far. She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside the coffee shop, the city continued its business with total indifference. Cabs and foot traffic, and the orange wash of streetlights on wet pavement from an earlier rain. And inside the narrow room with the warm lighting, two people who had been orbiting something for 6 months stopped orbiting it. I'd like to have dinner, she said. Not a working dinner, not a debriefing. Dinner. Okay, he said. With Caleb, she added. If that works. He looked at her for a moment. He thought about Caleb on the Saturday in the office, sliding the fraction worksheet across the desk without ceremony. The way he'd taken in Victoria's explanation and applied it and moved on with the direct practicality of a kid who evaluated people by whether they were useful to him in an honest way. He thought about the way Victoria had pulled up a chair and sat down beside him without making it a performance. "He'll want to know if you're good at baseball," Logan said. "Just so you know." "I'm not." "Tell him that. He'll respect it more than if you pretend." She nodded, seriously, as if this were strategic intelligence. "Noted." He finished his coffee. She finished hers. They walked out into the April night and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the specific, slightly suspended way of people who have arrived somewhere and are acknowledging it, even without saying what it is. "Tomorrow," she said. "Dinner. Friday." "Friday," he agreed. She turned toward the garage where her car was. He turned toward his. Two directions, two separate lives that had been built before any of this happened, and that were still fundamentally their own, with all the complexity and incompleteness that real lives carry, which was, Logan thought, walking to his truck in the April air, the only honest starting point for anything worth building. He told Caleb about dinner on Thursday night, over the pasta that was Caleb's standing Thursday night request, and that Logan made without variation because consistency in small things had turned out to matter more than he'd expected when Caleb was small, and they were still figuring out what their version of normal looked like. "Victoria's coming to dinner?" Caleb said, with the exact tone of someone cross-referencing new information against existing files. "Friday. I thought we'd go to that place on Clement you like." Caleb considered this while winding pasta around his fork with more concentration than the task required. "She's the one who explained fractions." "She is." "She was good at it." He looked up. "She didn't do that thing where they explain it slow because they think you're going to not get it." "No," Logan agreed. "She doesn't do that." Caleb resumed the pasta. Then, after a moment, with the specific casualness of an 8-year-old who has thought about something more than he's going to let on. "Is she your friend?" Logan looked at his son. He thought about the honest answer, which was the only kind of answer he'd ever tried to give Caleb, because Caleb was a kid who could tell the difference and who deserved the respect of the truth, even when the truth was still in the process of becoming. "Yes," he said. "She's my friend. And maybe more than that eventually. I don't know yet." Caleb absorbed this with the equanimity of someone who had been dealing with the honest versions of complex situations since he was 3 years old and had developed a certain tolerance for uncertainty. "Okay," he said. He looked at his pasta. "Does she know I'm going to ask her about baseball?" "I warned her." "Good." He pointed his fork at Logan. "She should know what she's getting into." Logan looked at his son, at this boy with his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn, assessing way of approaching the world, who had been the fixed point of Logan's life for 5 years, and who was, at 8 years old, entirely himself in a way that still surprised Logan regularly, the way the specific personhood of another human being surprises you when you're paying enough attention to actually see it. "Yeah," Logan said. "She should." Dinner on Friday was not a smooth event, which was correct, because smooth events are performances, and this was not a performance. Caleb was 20 minutes of careful social distance, followed by a question about whether Victoria had ever been to a professional baseball game, and when she said yes, once, as a client entertainment obligation that she had not fully enjoyed, he spent the next 10 minutes explaining, with the evangelical intensity of a recent convert, why she had been at the wrong game and had not been watching the right things, and that this was a correctable problem. Victoria listened to this with genuine attention and asked 2 follow-up questions that were specific enough that Caleb regarded her with a slightly revised expression, the expression of someone who had expected less and received more. By the end of the main course, he was showing her something on his phone, a video of a play from a game Logan didn't recognize, something Darius had sent him, and she was watching it and making the correct responses. Not performed enthusiasm, but actual interest. The interest of someone who finds most things worth paying attention to when the person explaining them cares about them. Logan sat across the table and ate his food and watched this and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, which was the specific ease of a moment that didn't require him to hold it up. It was just happening. It was imperfect and slightly chaotic, and Caleb had put too much Parmesan on his pasta, and Victoria had ordered something she didn't entirely like, but was eating without complaint, and the restaurant was a little loud, and none of it was what a story would describe as the culmination of anything. It was better than that. It was just a thing that was real. The sentencing hearings ran through April and into May. Logan attended 2 of them, not because he was required to. He'd given his formal testimony in February, but because Reyes had told him the hearings were open and something in him needed to see the process complete. Not closure exactly. He'd stopped believing in closure as a discrete event somewhere around his second deployment. More like confirmation. That the structure had held. That the thing that had happened had consequences that were proportionate to what it was. Marcus Hale received 12 years on the primary charges: conspiracy, financial fraud, the kidnapping and unlawful confinement charges that the federal prosecutors had built carefully and argued well. His attorneys had negotiated the financial fraud charges into a plea, which reduced the total exposure, but not by enough to make the outcome anything other than what it was. He looked, in the courtroom, like a man who had spent 8 months understanding the full weight of the calculation he'd made, and Logan watched him with the detachment of someone who had no interest in the emotional satisfaction of the moment, only in the factual resolution of it. The other 2 primary board conspirators received sentences in the range of 8 to 10 years, dependent on cooperation credits that were still being calculated. The contracting firm that had assembled and deployed the mercenary team was the subject of a separate federal investigation that reached across 3 jurisdictions and was ongoing in ways that Reyes said, with the understatement of a professional who knew how these things moved, would take some time. Of the 4 men Logan had dealt with directly inside the building, 2 were still facing trial, 1 had pleaded guilty and was serving time, and 1, the one on the 29th floor landing, the youngest of them, had cooperated fully with prosecutors from the first week and was in a different kind of legal situation that Logan had no further role in and no particular feelings about. He'd been a hired contractor, not an architect. The people who built the structure were in courtrooms. That was enough. He told Victoria about the second sentencing hearing on the following Monday, in her office, the way he would have told her about any operational development that was part of the case. She listened without interrupting, which was something she'd gotten better at, or maybe something he'd gotten better at noticing. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. "Is it over?" she asked. Not meaning the legal process, meaning something more interior than that. He thought about it honestly. "Most of it," he said. "The part that's mine to finish is..." She nodded. "And the building?" "The building's the safest it's been since it was constructed." He looked at her. "UN found 2 additional network vulnerabilities last week. We're closing them Friday." Of course she did. Victoria looked at her desk, then back at him. "I keep thinking about what it was before. The security division, what we thought was sufficient." She paused. "I accepted a lot of things as sufficient that weren't." "Most people do," Logan said. "It's not specific to you." "I know, I just..." She stopped. "I want to be the person who looked at things clearly. I thought I was." "You're more that person now than you were," Logan said. "Not because of what happened, because of what you did with it afterward." She looked at him across the desk. He had said things to her over the past 6 months that she'd taken in the way she took in most information, carefully, with some part of her assessing it for accuracy before allowing it to land. This one landed without the assessment phase. "I'm harder on myself than I should be," she said. "Yes." "You could have said that more gently." "I could have," he agreed. She shook her head, but there was something in her expression that was light, unexpectedly. The specific lightness of someone who is tired of weight and has found, in a particular relationship, a place where the weight is acknowledged without being made heavier. "Go do your perimeter check," she said. He stood, moved to the door. "Dinner tomorrow?" "Caleb has baseball." "After baseball." "After baseball," she said. The rooftop access was not something Logan used regularly. The building's rooftop was functional space, HVAC units and antenna mounts, and the mechanical infrastructure that kept 43 floors of people comfortable, and it was not the kind of place that invited lingering. He'd been up there twice in his 6 months as security director, both times for assessment purposes, checking the access points and the sight lines and the specific vulnerabilities of a space that most people in the building never thought about. He went up there on a Thursday evening in May, alone, for no reason that he would have been able to fully explain if anyone had asked. The building was quiet at that hour, the evening crew cycling through the lower floors, and he took the maintenance elevator to the 43rd and then the roof access stair up through the mechanical penthouse and out through the heavy door that opened onto the flat expanse of the building's top. The city spread in every direction, lit against a sky that was doing the particular thing it did in May, between 7 and 8 in the evening, that gradual shift from late-day gold to early evening blue that wasn't fully either one. He stood near the north parapet and looked at it, and the city looked back at him with complete indifference, which was correct and which he found, as always, more honest than the alternative would have been. He thought about the first time he'd been on this roof, not during the incident, but months before it, checking the antenna mounts as part of his maintenance rounds. A morning in December of the previous year, when the temperature had been in the 30s, and the sky had been the flat white of a city winter, and he had been, in the most precise sense of the word, invisible. Not in a dramatic sense, just in the way that a person becomes invisible when they are doing work that the people around them require but don't think about. When they have been sorted by the assumptions of the people they work for into a category that doesn't include the full truth of who they are. He had accepted that invisibility as the cost of the life he'd chosen. He'd chosen it deliberately, in fact, chosen maintenance work, chose a job that kept his head down and his son fed and his past at a distance, chose small and manageable over significant and exposed. He had not been wrong to make that choice, given what he needed at the time, and he didn't revise it now with the comfortable hindsight of a man whose circumstances had changed. What he thought, standing on the roof in the May evening, was something simpler and more difficult than regret or vindication. He thought, a person is not a fixed thing. He had been a SEAL, and then he had been a maintenance worker, and now he was a security director, and a single father, and a man who was, with more honesty than he'd managed in some time, in the beginning of something with a woman who was not uncomplicated and not easy, and not the version of a relationship that makes life simpler, which was the only version he'd concluded somewhere in the past 6 months that was actually worth having. He had been all of those things, and he was still himself, recognizably, entirely, the same person who had crouched next to a corroded relay coupling on an ordinary Tuesday morning and noticed too many things to let the morning stay ordinary. That continuity was not something he'd understood as a young man. He'd thought, at 22, that the version of himself he would become would replace the versions that came before, that each new context would produce a new person who would leave the previous one behind. The military had taken that idea and done something thorough to it. What it left was the understanding that you were always carrying all of it, the training and the loss and the choice to leave and the years of ordinary work and the morning with the orange juice and the backpack and the boy who was going to be 9 years old in 3 months and who was, by all available evidence, going to be a specific and surprising person in ways Logan hadn't predicted and was glad he hadn't, because the surprises were the best parts. He heard the roof access door behind him. He knew her footstep by now, had for months, the specific weight and cadence of it, the way she moved through a space with an attention to where she was going that was not tentative but was not aggressive either, the movement of someone who had learned to be purposeful without being careless about what she ran into. He didn't turn around. She came to stand beside him at the parapet. She was still in her work clothes, her jacket on now against the evening chill, and she looked at the city the same way he was looking at it. Not performing the looking, just doing it. "Priya told me you came up here," she said. "Priya tracks a lot." "She does. It's useful." A pause. "I wanted to see it." "The roof?" "The view from here." She looked at the city for a moment. "I've been in this building for 4 years and I've never come up here." "Most people haven't." "You have." "Twice?" "Both times for work." He looked at the city. "This is the 3rd time." She glanced at him. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask him to, which was something about her he'd come to value more than he'd expected. She didn't push at the things he left unlabeled, not out of disinterest, but out of the understanding that some things were offered in their own time or not at all. They stood there for a while. The city did what the city did, indifferent and enormous and lit up against the darkening sky, and the HVAC units ran their steady cycles. And somewhere below them the building held 43 floors of people who were finishing their days and going home to their versions of the lives they'd built, unaware that 2 people were standing on the roof above all of it with the particular quiet of people who have finished something difficult and are standing in what comes after. I was thinking about something you said, Victoria said. The day of the incident, in the lobby, after. What specifically? When Reyes asked why you went back in, you told her about the people still under desks. She looked at the parapet, at the city beyond it. But that's not all of it, is it? He thought about it. About Caleb's voice in his head on the 33rd floor, the orange juice, the sound of that laugh. About the feeling on the mechanical bridge of watching 17 people cross towards safety. About the way Gerald Marsh had held his phone in that server closet like the weight of it meant something. No, he said. It's not all of it. What's the rest? He looked at her. At the profile of her face in the evening light. The specific focused attention she brought to everything, including this. A question she'd asked because she genuinely wanted the answer, not because she wanted the version of it that would be easiest to hear. I went back because leaving felt like being a different person than I actually was, he said. I'd spent 2 years trying to be smaller than I am, quieter, more contained. He paused. That's not wrong, necessarily. Sometimes you need to be smaller for a while. But there's a point where smaller just becomes less. And I didn't want to be less. She was quiet for a moment. I spent years being enormous, she said, taking up every room, every conversation, every decision, because I thought that's what it took. She looked at the city. Marcus Hale was in the room when I made most of the major decisions of the past 4 years. He was right there. And I was so focused on the next thing, the next acquisition, the next quarter, that I didn't see him clearly. She exhaled. That's not a small thing to get wrong. No, Logan said, it's not. But I built the thing anyway, she said. The company, the structure, people's jobs, it exists because I built it. She said it not with pride exactly, but with the particular recognition of someone who is accounting for their own life honestly. That was real. It was real. And the part where I almost lost it because I couldn't see who was standing next to me. She looked at him. That was real too. Also real, he said. Both things. She turned to face him fully, there on the roof, with the city behind her and the evening light doing what it did. And she looked like herself, fully, specifically herself. Not the CEO performing competence. Not the woman managing the aftermath of a crisis. Just Victoria, 30 years old and exhausted and honest and here. I don't want to be enormous anymore, she said. I want to be right-sized, for what I'm actually doing, for the people I'm actually with. He looked at her for a long moment. You're already further along on that than you think. You keep saying that. It keeps being true. She looked at him, and something in her expression settled into itself, the way things settle when they found where they belong. She reached out and took his hand, not dramatically, just the simple fact of it, her hand in his, neither of them making more of it than it was or less. They stood like that for a while. The city below them continued its business. The sky finished its transition from evening to night, the first stars becoming visible in the gaps between clouds. The kind of small, ordinary thing that happens every night, and that people mostly don't see because they're inside looking at something smaller. Logan thought about Caleb, asleep at home with the hall light on, being cared for by the neighbor Mrs. Alvarez, who had been their emergency backup since Caleb was 4, and who charged $40 a night and always left the dishes done, which was a specific human kindness that Logan had never stopped being grateful for. He thought about tomorrow, which would have Caleb's baseball practice and a security review with Ewan and a call with Reyes about the ongoing investigation and dinner with Victoria, probably at the Thai place because it was close and because the owner knew their order and because consistency in small things still mattered. Nothing about tomorrow would be remarkable from the outside. It would just be a day in the life of a man who had finally stopped treating his own life as something to be managed at arm's length. That was the thing, he thought, that nobody had told him when he was young and certain and deployable, that the hardest mission was not the dangerous one. The hardest mission was the one you came home to. The daily, imperfect, unglamorous work of being present for the people who needed you, not in the moments that tested everything you had, but in the morning when the orange juice spilled, and the evening when the homework was frustrating, and the ordinary Thursday with the pasta and the too much parmesan, and the child explaining baseball with evangelical intensity to a woman who was trying, genuinely trying, to understand why it mattered. The Navy had not prepared him for that. Nothing had prepared him for that. You just did it, imperfectly, and kept doing it, And it turned out that was enough. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was real. And real was the only thing that actually held. Victoria's hand was warm in his. The city lights spread below them in every direction, enormous and various, and entirely indifferent to the two of them standing on a rooftop in May, which was correct and which was fine, because they weren't standing up here for the city. "We should go," she said eventually. "It's getting cold." "Yeah." Neither of them moved for another minute. Then they did, together, away from the parapet and toward the roof access door and the elevator and the lobby and the separate cars and the directions their lives ran in that were not yet the same direction but were, increasingly, aware of each other. Logan pulled the roof door closed behind them. The mechanism latched with a solid sound, final and ordinary, the sound of a door that has been opened and closed 10,000 times and will be opened and closed 10,000 more. He went home to his son. The hall light was on. He stood in the doorway of Caleb's room for a moment, the way he did every night, long enough to confirm the sound of steady breathing and the star-patterned sheets, and the particular shape of a sleeping child who was, against all odds and by no design that Logan had been strategic enough to execute, growing up okay. Growing up, in fact, into someone Logan looked forward to knowing, which was the thing about children that nobody told you until you were already in it, that they became people, specific and surprising people. And that watching that happen was the closest thing to an unearned gift that life offered. He pulled the door nearly closed, left the hall light on, walked to his own room, sat on the edge of the bed, looked at his hands, the cut on his left forearm long healed to a faint line of scar tissue, the hands that had been trained for things he no longer needed to do as often, and that were now, mostly, the hands of a man who fixed things in the ordinary course of work, who held his son's hand crossing streets even though Caleb was nearly old enough to not need it, who had tonight held a woman's hand on a rooftop and not made it complicated. He lay back and looked at the ceiling and thought, this is the life. Not the life he'd planned, not the life that had been interrupted, not the life rebuilt from damage, just the life. His. The one that was happening now with all its specific and imperfect and genuinely inhabited details. And he was, without ceremony or resolution or the feeling of an ending, in it. That was enough. That was actually everything.